James Fitzgerald was born on 25 November 1867 in the village of Maple Park, about 60 miles due west of Chicago. He was the youngest living child and only son of Joseph Fitzgerald and Ellen Burke, immigrants from County Clare, Ireland. James grew up in the village of Maple Park, where his father was a saloon keeper. James learned how to run a general store in Hutchinson, Kansas, from his brother-in-law, John Klein. James suggested to his son years later that Hutchinson was a backwater, as it could only be reached by stagecoach. The lack of a nearby railroad was significant for the time. It was either train or beasts of burden to get you where you wanted to go. By 1895, James's sister Mary was no longer living with John Klein, and the couple were divorced by 1900. Divorce is a significant and painful event today, and roughly 40% of first marriages end in divorce. But in 1900, the divorce rate was less than 0.1%. Mary's divorce from John Klein must have been an excruciating family crisis. It's hard to imagine James continuing to work for his brother-in-law after his sister had divorced him. James's son wrote later that his family never spoke to John Klein's brother, who also ran a general store in Maple Park, a town of just a few hundred people. By 1900, James was back in Maple Park and had started his own general store in partnership with Frank Austin. In June of 1901, James married another 32-year-old, Teresa McGurr from Afton Township, a town just a few miles southwest of Maple Park. The wedding announcement in the DeKalb Daily Chronicle noted that the groom is a clean-cut young man, one of Maple Park's most successful tradesmen. He is as square as a brick in a business way, and personally is as genial and pleasant a companion as one could wish for. Today, a couple marrying at age 32 is mundane, but in 1900, this was a surprisingly late age. The median first marriage age for men in the United States was 26. The couple had 2 children together, Nellie, born in 1902, and Joseph in 1904. James's father, Joseph, died of heart failure about 5 months before the birth of his son in 1904. Teresa began experiencing a series of health problems, probably after the birth of Joseph in 1904. On 14 July 1916, Teresa died of a gastric ulcer, leaving James a widower at 47, with 2 children to raise. James's son Joseph wrote decades later that it was not an easy task for my father to raise 2 children, one in 7th grade, and my sister Nellie, 2 years older. It was hard to get a housekeeper, and the first one was a girl from the St. Charles Reformatory School. She did not turn out very well. She took my mother's clothes. And it was a long time before we got an older woman, Mrs. Miller, and later Mrs. Clark. If James had help from his family raising his children in the first few years after Teresa died, his mother, who lived across the corner from his store in a white clapboard house, was the most likely candidate. James's sisters and siblings-in-law all lived in different towns. Judging by undated photos of James's mother from the teens, she had suffered from a stroke, so the relationship may actually have been reversed, and James had to care for his mother as well as his 2 children. James's mother Ellen died in 1919. James's son Joseph wrote extensively about the general store, the town, and the culture in which he grew up. Joseph's daughters all have copies of his memoirs, which is also available at mikeoneal.us. There's no way I can summarize those memoirs. They're worth a read. But as a family that enjoys a drink or 3, I think it's worth mentioning how the dry movement benefited James's business. Many towns adjacent to Maple Park banned the sale of alcohol before the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919. Unlike their neighbors, however, Maple Park stayed wet, and every Friday and Saturday night, James converted his dry goods store to a saloon, serving everyone from wet locals to people who had voted to ban alcohol in their own towns. It's easy to imagine that the drinks James served on weekend nights helped lubricate the sale of his dry goods as well. But the prosperity of the 1910s and early 1920s was short-lived for James. His son wrote that, in addition to heart and eye problems that cropped up around 1923, the store began to lose money because of the decline of the small town. Good roads encouraged the farmers to trade at DeKalb, Sycamore, and Aurora. The Good Roads movement began to push for paved roads in the United States at the turn of the 1900s, advocating replacing the dirt tracks that turned to mud every spring and paralyzed commerce into hard paved roads. Bicyclist groups actually started the lobbying for better roads, but between the new automobile industry and the oppressive monopoly powers of railroads at the time, political momentum for a new transportation infrastructure began to grow. By 1920, the Lincoln Highway, which theoretically connected Manhattan and San Francisco via Maple Park, amongst other places, was inaugurated. It was more of a marketing concept really a map connecting existing, better-maintained roads. But the stretch between Chicago and DeKalb that went through Maple Park was hard-paved road by then. Why did this matter? In a world of mud tracks, merchants in small towns throughout the United States were critical middlemen in commerce. Farmers would bring their goods via horse, mule, or ox-drawn carts to the nearest town along a railway, such as Maple Park, and exchange their produce for manufactured goods. And I mean exchange. A lot of times no currency was involved. Why sell your produce to a small merchant in Maple Park when you could cut out the middleman via a few more miles of hard-paved road to the town of DeKalb, and probably earn a bit more money to boot? Perhaps if James's health hadn't taken a decline at the same time, he could have kept his store going. But by 1923, his son Joseph was forced to drop out of law school to help keep the business afloat. By 1926, Fitzgerald's general store entered bankruptcy, and there was little money left after all the debts were cleared. James and his son moved to Evanston to live with his daughter and son-in-law, Maurice O'Brien, and their infant son. On 5 May 1929, a mild, cloudy Wednesday afternoon, according to the Chicago Tribune, James died sitting in a chair in his daughter's home. His death certificate notes a heart attack. He was 61, and his children were 27 and 25.